to that pizza slice? At this point, the fats in the cheese are part of the chyme, and that stimulates the enteroendocrine cells, or hormone secreting cells, of the small intestine to secrete a hormone, called cholecystokinin, into the blood. The cholecystokinin makes its way to the gallbladder, the thin-walled green sac snuggling up against the liver. It signals it to squeeze out some bile through the cystic and bile ducts into the small intestine. This is pretty much your gallbladder's job. Store and concentrate the bile that's made by the liver until the time comes to squirt it out into the small intestine. That bile emulsifies the fat, essentially making fat organize into small micelles, which are tiny bubbles of mixed lipids and bile acids, rather than disorganized clumps, which makes them easier to absorb. And this is where the pancreas comes in. The pancreas is a long, skinny gland the length of a dollar bill, snuggled around the duodenum. Cholecystokinin stimulates acinar cells in the pancreas to secrete digestive enzymes that travel through the pancreatic ducts and into the duodenum. One enzyme is pancreatic lipase, which grabs the triglycerides hanging out in those micelles and breaks them down into fatty acids and glycerol. There's also pancreatic amylase, which breaks down carbohydrates into shorter oligosaccharides, and proteases, like trypsin, which cleaves proteins down into smaller peptides. Now, to prevent the hydrochloric acid of the stomach from damaging the intestinal mucosa, enteroendocrine cells also secrete another hormone, called secretin, which stimulates the pancreatic duct cells to secrete water and bicarbonate. Bicarbonate helps neutralize the acidic chyme. Raising the pH of the intestinal lumen also helps digestive enzymes work more effectively. A generous amount of bicarbonate is also secreted by a number of glands lying in the submucosa of the duodenal wall. At this point, we're almost ready for absorption. Fatty acids and glycerol can easily pass through the small intestinal epithelium and into the lymphatics. But to help absorb sugars, there are special enzymes on the top surface or brush border of the intestinal cells called brush border enzymes. These are maltase, sucrase, and lactase, which break down the short chains of sugars called oligosaccharides into simple sugars called monosaccharides. These include glucose, fructose, and galactose. Similarly, there are peptidases, which break down peptide chains into single amino acids. The epithelial cells can absorb these nutrients into the bloodstream, and from there, they can go to the various tissues around the body. Alright, so whatever isn't absorbed, like fiber, continues its journey onward through the ileocecal sphincter, and into the very last part of the gastrointestinal tract, the large intestine, also known as the colon. The large intestine is basically a 1.5 meter or 5 foot long loop that frames the small intestine and consists of 6 parts. The cecum, which has this tiny worm-like little outpouching called the appendix, the ascending colon that climbs along the right side of the abdomen, the transverse colon right beneath the diaphragm, the descending colon running down the left side of the abdomen, the S-shaped sigmoid colon, and finally, the rectum. When chyme hits the cecum, it's met by trillions of bacteria that colonize the large intestine. They're collectively called the gut microbiome. This microbiome is still trying to be studied and understood, but we know that the bacteria help produce essential B and K vitamins, as well as gases like carbon dioxide, methane, and sulfurous compounds, which sometimes get released in awkward moments. The chyme slowly moves through the large intestine via small waves of peristalsis that take place over hours or even days. The large intestine absorbs excess water from the chyme, and that helps condense it into dry fecal matter. And that feces eventually ends up in the rectum. Once the rectum is filled and stretched, signals travel to the parasympathetic neurons in the spinal cord, initiating the defecation reflex. These parasympathetic neurons make the rectum contract and the internal anal sphincter relax. Meanwhile, signals are sent to the brainstem and thalamus, and when these decide the right moment has come, they allow the external anal sphincter to relax, and feces goes, hopefully, into the toilet bowl. Alright, as a quick recap, food is ingested through the mouth, chewed by the teeth, mixed with saliva, and turned into a bolus. The bolus is then moved by peristalsis through the esophagus and into the stomach, where hydrochloric acid is secreted and pepsin begins the digestion process. Next is the small intestine, where most of the digestion and absorption occurs with the help of the liver's bile coming from the gallbladder and the pancreatic enzymes. Finally, the large intestine absorbs water, The feces forms and gets excreted through the anus.